Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cybercriminals are hiding in the conversation. Cybercriminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified these 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Hey, welcome everyone to Paul's Security Weekly. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. I'm joined by Mandy Logan, Josh Marpet, Mr. Jeff Mann. I got all the hosts, right?
Yes.
What's up, everyone? Good to have you here.
Greetings.
Joining us for this segment, super excited. I'm a huge fan of these folks' podcasts. So joining us today are Kurt Seifried and Josh Bressers, the host of the Open Source Security Podcast. They also have day jobs that support their podcasting habit. Josh is the VP of Security at Anchor, and Kurt is the Chief Blockchain Officer and Director of Special Projects at the Cloud Security Alliance. Josh and Kurt, welcome to Paul Security Weekly.
Thank you so much.
It's so
Thanks for having us.
This is great. It's wonderful to hear your voices. Like I said, I'm a huge fan. I want to ask
you should say it's wonderful to see their faces, since you usually only hear their voices.
I know. It's amazing. So I want to ask you both, how did you get your start in information security? Josh is up on my screen, so I'll start with Josh and then go to Kurt.
All right. I mean, man, that's a question. So I think I would blame kind of the hacker groups in the early 90s. I came of age essentially in the heyday of groups like Cult of the Dead Cow, and you had the Legion of Doom, and there were all these just amazing hacking security groups. And as a kid, I was like, I wanna be like these people. And so I kind of started down that road of learning as much as I could about security. And eventually I realized that there's way more money to be made and, kind of being legit. So here I am, a real security person these days.
Legit. Kurt, what about yourself?
Sort of the same. I was 17, got a computer, Windows 3.1.1, and a friend introduced me to OS2 and then into Linux. And so I connected to the internet, 9600 dial-up, and about a couple weeks in, realized I could connect to everything on the internet. So everything on the internet could connect back to my system, right? And that's literally, I started trying to figure out how to secure my system, thinking because I'm logging into all these remote systems to play games and stuff. So how's my system safe? And this is not 98, and wrote the Linux Administrator Security Guide and never escaped.
Yeah, it was that. And so how did you guys get involved with open source? You seem both to have some deep backgrounds in open source.
I mean, what else are you going to use when you're 17 and have no money?
Right. I was poor. So.
Yeah. I actually bought OS2 and paid for the TCP/IP add-on pack and paid for the NFS add-on pack and realized Linux gives this.
You're that guy?
And the apps.
Yeah, you're and it wasn't even OS2 Warp at that point, which was far superior to the regular OS2.
Yeah. And then Linux had a GUI for free, it had games, it had a word process, it had everything for free. So kind of a no-brainer.
That's right. I lacked the $45,000 needed to buy a Sun workstation.
Yeah, right?
And so how did you guys get together and do a podcast? When did that start?
Oh man, I love this story. So Kurt and I both worked together at Red Hat back in the early mid 2000s, the aughts, whatever we call them. It's been a while. But anyway, I remember I met Kurt, and the first thing I thought when I met him in person was, I want to do a podcast with this guy someday, just because he has an energy about him and the way he speaks of things. And then eventually it just kind of all the right pieces fell into place. And I was like, Kurt, we should do a podcast. We'll call it the Open Source Security Podcast. I mean, this was in the early days too, before podcasting
7 years ago.
It's been a while. Yeah. And so, and it's been a ton of fun, and we keep doing it. It's, it's a passion.
Who's responsible for choosing the world's worst podcast music?
That was me.
Come on.
That was, and there's a specific reason for that. That is a piece of music called Piano Galop.
Circus Gallop.
No, Circus Galop, sorry. And essentially it was a torture test for player pianos, and it's a piece of music that no human can play. And so this is from the 1800s. We already have machines surpassing humans.
I didn't know the backstory, but like I think it's like it's so bad it's good kind of music.
Yeah,
right.
The best is the YouTube visualizations of it. It's just like you would. Well, a piano has 101 keys, and that's basically how many fingers you would need to play this thing.
That's right.
Nice.
And I'm also very lazy, so like every now and then I think, I should change the intro music, and then I'm like, it's good enough.
I think you have to stick with it now. I think we established you have to stick with it now that I got the backstory, especially. And
I like how Josh has also now made the move into instead of looking for stock photos for each episode, just shoves it through what is it, DALL-E, or which one are you using?
Yeah, DALL-E. It's so amazing. I mean, like, so the episode we just published not long ago, which was, what did I name it? Something about 2 peas in a pod.
Mm-hmm.
And I just typed into DALL-E, like, I want a suitcase full of peas. And I got it. I'm like,
describe for our
amazing.
But describe for our audience, Josh, what you're referring to, because I think it does represent the future, especially in this application.
Yeah, okay. So obviously we publish a podcast. I used to go digging for clip art, or not clip art, stock photos from wherever I could find them, right, to put as the kind of podcast image. And there's now a thing called DALL-E, which is that like AI generated art where you just kind of explain what you're looking for and it generates it. And so like in my instance, I wanted a suitcase full of peas, which may exist as stock photography, but I'm skeptical. Whereas I go to DALL-E and I just say, I want a suitcase full of peas. And it generated a suitcase full of peas for me. It's amazing.
It's awesome. I mean, it's a lot easier than getting a suitcase and filling it with peas too.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Also, point of clarification, there's only 88 keys on a piano.
Right.
Oh, keyboards have 101 keys.
Yeah, sorry.
Keyboards have 100.
Yeah, okay.
It was bugging me.
I feel like the choice of the music kind of goes along with being open source, because in this case, it sounds like you were ensuring security of nobody taking your music by choosing something that's horrible.
Well, so the copyright is obviously expired. I found a royalty-free recording of Circus Gallop. And yeah, that was part of it, is obviously I needed music. There was, back in those days, it was really hard to find music. So yeah, I found crappy music that was free and away we went.
Have you heard of Black MIDI, which is the aftercursor, the descendant of Circus Gallop?
I don't think I have.
No.
So Black MIDI, they said that Circus Gallop is actually the predecessor to Black MIDI. Black MIDI is actually MIDI music that's designed to have hundreds or thousands of notes being played at the same time.
Nice.
So it's literally impossible for anybody to play them.
Nice.
And it's so you might want to check out there for more intro music.
Now, Josh and Kurt, one of the things that I really love about your show is there's this kind of underlying tone or theme of open source supply chain security, for lack of a better term. We can go in a lot of different directions in that, right? Was that like on purpose, or like how did you come to kind of focus in on like largely supply chain security issues as they're related to open source?
I think it's partly our shared experience. Like we both worked at Red Hat, where we did security at scale. Like Red Hat, when we were there, was processing like 3,000-4,000 vulnerabilities a year.
Yeah.
And I assigned, 6,000 to 8,000 CVs while I was there. And prior to that, I'd done work at scale as well with other companies. But the thing is, at Red Hat, like we would have somebody come to us to report a security vulnerability, and they were like so stressed and excited, and like, I found this cross-site script, and I'm like, could you put it in the pile, please? Right. And the other thing too is not just the number of vulnerabilities at scale, but like Red Hat had over 100 products when I left. Like, I once unpacked all the source code for RHEL 7 or 6, removed all the images and like all the not code stuff, and it was tens of gigabytes of source code. So it's just that experience of doing this at scale and having to like with OpenSSL Heartbleed, like, okay, I need a list of everything using OpenSSL. Like in the next 2 hours, please.
I like to tell people that we were doing supply chain before supply chain was cool.
Yeah, except we were doing it with like text files and grep.
That's right.
Well, but I think the promise of open source when it came to security was it was Linus's famous quote, something along the lines of, "With enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow." Can we dismiss that today? Is that
it's nonsense?
It's those eyeballs have to be looking. They have to be qualified. I think the real power of open source is that number one, you could figure out who wrote the code and you can go bug them and shame them, sort of. Not that you should, but the other thing is you can actually fix it. Like if I find hypothetically, I find a 0-day kernel exploit in Apple in my iPhone. I can't fix it. I have to go tell Apple nicely and hope that they do. Whereas with Linux, I would tell them and they would probably fix it. And if they didn't fix it, I could just post a patch and like everybody would be like, okay, you need this patch because otherwise, code execution. And that's the thing with open source.
But you can't necessarily fix it, Kurt, in all cases.
Well, no, but I'm saying it's possible.
I'm not a kernel developer, so if I find a kernel but which if I'm not a kernel developer or at least familiar enough with the kernel, I'm probably not going to find that bug in the first place. Let's say that I do. Like fixing it is a whole different skill level that, like, let's be honest, most of us don't have.
No, and look, I'm gonna stop you, Kurt, because I can, and this is just how
Josh's
the show
job.
works.
Yeah. Josh's job is
that's right.
Yeah,
really back in. Look, people want free stuff. Let's face it, open source is free, and I think that's the appeal. And like the Linus's law, which just I guess technically it was Eric Raymond who coined that, not Linus. But Linus's law is nonsense, and we kind of all agree with that. And I think fundamentally, open source was free. It was easy to use. Now, as a company, I can focus on whatever my critical features are instead of having someone writing like a freaking TCP/IP stack or whatever. And I think we used so much open source, and open source, there's the old quote, software ate the world. Well, open source ate software. But now I think the bill is starting to come due. And this is why we're seeing all this attention being paid to supply chain and how are we going to secure it and what's going on. And to date, I think all things considered, open source has done pretty darn well in the big picture, but that's not a free pass for the future by any means.
We've certainly accumulated a lot of technical debt in open source. When you say open source software, that implies that there's a lot of technical debt to catch up on. And if you look at the number of millions of lines of code, you're right. We're actually maybe not that bad.
Well, I would point out if the lights are working, you have food in your fridge, the water's running, like clearly it kind of mostly works. The other thing too with open source is that it's not just that it's free, but we're at a point now where all the simple stuff is done. It's available as an easy library, and everything that's not done is horrifically difficult. And when I say simple things like web servers, like you, and by you I mean like the royal you as a large Fortune 100 company cannot write a web server anymore. Like unless you're maybe Microsoft, and Microsoft is still struggling with IIS. Like there's literally one company on the planet that writes a web server. Everybody else just was like, open source. It's just everything's too complicated now.
We still have to deal with the security fallout from that and the supply chain that when we get our web servers, making sure that they're not backdoored. But I don't think that the answer, and when I conveyed this to the rest of the team, because I heard you guys talking about it, the answer is not to go, hey, we're big Fortune 100 companies. We're using open source web servers. Great example, Kurt. And you know what? Whoever's developing these, like, can you make sure you've got two-factor authentication and you're following these secure coding guidelines and that you're practicing responsible disclosure? And we want you to fix critical vulnerabilities within 7 days. And we want you to use these memory protect. There's this notion that large companies are like, well, since you're giving it away for free and we're using it, like, we want you to abide by these rules and guidelines. And that's just not fair.
Right. Well, I call that they want us to do their homework for them.
Well, and part of it is how mature is their use of open source. Like there's the ones that just strip mine open source, swack it on a TV and never maintain it. And then there's more mature ones, for example, that pay Red Hat and and have that mindset of, yes, we want this fixed right away, so we're going to buy it from Red Hat and yell at Red Hat, who we gave money and now have the privilege of yelling at. All the way to the companies that are big enough to actually get involved and steward their own open source projects or get heavily involved in the stuff that they need to work and to be fixed.
And look, this is our challenge. This is the great thing that we have to overcome. Now, open source became super popular. Now we're talking about all this supply chain, everything that's going on, and we don't know how to fix this. And obviously asking open source to do our homework for us isn't the solution. You can ask, but they're not going to do it. And you're going to learn some new words in the process. But we don't have answers. And I think that's part of the, excitement of this phase of computing. I think if you look back a couple of years, you could have made the argument that, software is getting boring and we solved, like Kurt said, a lot of the hard problems and what are we doing? But the reality is we just have new and different problems, and it's exciting, sometimes scary, but I am completely confident we will sort this out because we just have to as like a human species. It is part of our future problems.
One of the things, and I want to turn it over to my other host as well, but one of the things that I wanted to get your take on was not just, we talked a little bit about software bugs, right? But also I think part of that supply chain is the package maintainer, is the packaging of that software. And oftentimes that's where it falls down. I noticed this interesting thing with Arch Linux packages. I'm going to cover a story about it later tonight, but it was the Arch Linux package maintainer can actually set a flag that says skip the signature checking. Now, when that happens, I called out on Twitter, and nobody listened, and I called out on Twitter, and I was like, hey, when this happens, if a package maintainer goes, I'm turning off signature verification for these files or for this entire package, I, as the user administrator, should get a warning or notification and have the ability to go, either I accept this package or I don't, because someone turned off the verification. But that doesn't exist today. And I think there's a lot of little nuanced cases like that the packaging of software needs a lot of work.
I think one of the challenges is, though, the problem is, though, okay, number one, everybody uses open source. Like that's a done deal. And the people that are using open source don't have an alternative. Like, what are you going to do? Not use it and write your own?
Right.
You're going to go buy some commercial software?
I don't want to maintain all my own software packages, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I use like Python pip a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And if pip were to do something insecure, stupid, well, I guess I have to live with it, because what am I going to do? Right. And that's part of the challenge is, in some ways, these developers have a lot of power because, well, just economically speaking, it's just so infeasible for the rest of us to recreate all that work.
Wait. But your point, hang on a second. Your point is valid, but valid for the entire world. And what I mean by that is, in the commercial software world, if your commercial software vendor who designs and builds the software says, oh, we're not going to do signature verification, what are you going to do? Rebuild it yourself? You literally can't by the terms of the contract.
Yeah.
Yeah.
SolarWinds literally told people, like, smash that install button because the signature's theft up. Just, it's fine. And that's basically, once you've deployed a software package or committed to it, or worse, you're importing it into stuff you build, you're stuck with it.
All right, let me reframe this. Let me reframe this a little bit. I think we can reframe this, Kurt, in a way that might be more receptive to the folks listening. So you can make the argument that there's a certain expectation on developers for, let's say, not or fixing security issues. You can say that we expect the packaging ecosystems to sign things, or if a developer does something weird, warn us or whatever. But the question I always come back to is, like, what are the incentives to do this right? And today, in the case of a lot of these packaging ecosystems, you have a lot of people using it and they complain a lot and they get very little back from it, right? And so they're kind of at just the whim of dealing with the fire hose of complaining. No matter what they do, they're wrong. And so I think one of the things we have to think about is, how do we give people incentives to do things correctly? And I don't have an answer for this necessarily, but there's a lot of people using, say, Arch Linux. How do we encourage Arch Linux to do the right thing that isn't, complaining on Twitter, which I think is the only thing we can really do today?
That was like my only outlet was to complain.
That's the wrong question.
Twitter, right?
For a few more weeks until it implodes.
Yeah.
Open source Josh, I think you're asking the wrong question.
Could be.
Okay, the question you asked is, what is the incentive to get it right? How do I make sure that people are going to get it right? Ask it the other way, which is, what is the incentive for people to do it wrong, to be malicious? And how do we remove those incentives?
Well, I mean,
that's a fair point.
It is a fair point, but the incentive is laziness too. Like, I'm doing this thing for free, so, like, do I want to go through all the work of, applying the signature to every single file? Yeah, every single file in there. But
why? But Paul, why did you have you've ranted for weeks now about package management systems and how they if a malicious person got their hands on some credentials, some trust in the package management world, they could destroy God knows how many millions of installs by one evil grade somewhere or other. So it's not just laziness, which is not maliciousness, but it's not being good. It's sort of in between.
You're
It's
right.
neutral.
You're right, Josh.
Well,
Those are different things, Kurt.
Well, we've seen this with like what is it, colors.js, and that the other package where the guy put literally a thing called infinite loop in and like broke them because he had a tantrum.
Yeah.
And part of the beauty of open source is the transparency issue, where the community kind of reacted to it very rapidly and dealt with it very rapidly. And that's, I think, one of the superpowers of open source is, like as terrible as Log4j was, there was literally hashtag Log4Shell, coordinated it on Twitter magically, and it just sort of worked out. The world didn't end. And that's something that you can't do with closed source, right? With closed source, you're just you got to hope that the vendor does something or admits to it or even acknowledges it before anything can happen. Whereas with an open source, you can at least warn people. You can show the proof, like, hey, there's a thing called infinite loop that like messes up your system. And then the package ecosystem people pulled the packages, updated them, fixed it. Like it happened in, what was it, hours or 1 or 2 days? It was a very short.
Yeah, it was tiny fragment of time. Agreed.
But Kurt, I share your optimism though, because let's go back to my Arch Linux example. Someone evaluated all of the Arch Linux packages, I think in AUR, right? Arch Linux user repository. And he said, look, if you're importing software from a domain that has been expired, I can take over that. I can register that domain and I can insert my own software. I just have to get around the signature thing. So show me all the packages that have removed signature verification. There ended up being, I forget how many, 14 or something like that. And they reported that to Arch Linux and those packages got pulled right away. I was like, oh, yeah. That's a great example of your point, Kurt. Like, they do react, which is important.
And the thing is, they can react because like there's no contracts with paying customers. We yanked that package. Too bad. Right. I just found out today there was an OpenSSL 3.0.6. I was like, because I looked at the downloads page and they say 305, and I'm like, okay, they skipped to 307. That's weird. Whatever. I don't know. I'm like, there's no 306. And somebody's like, there was a 306, but it got withdrawn. And so I hunted it down an hour or two ago, and it's like it had some weird regressions, and they pulled it, and they didn't announce it via email, and it was in their GitHub issues. But OpenSSL can do that. Like they can just be like, hey, we released 306 and turns out it's broken. So yoink. And like, if you needed 306 or whatever, too bad. Like we yoinked it. A company like Microsoft or Red Hat can't do that as easily. They can't just ship something and be like, nope, yoink.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how OpenSSL does that. One of my other hosts and I were looking at the GitHub repository, and one of the branches was like so many, like almost 1,000 commits ahead of master and also 1,000 commits behind master. I'm like, I don't know how you're doing that. My brain hurts right now, but hopefully you've got a handle on that. And I don't have to do anything with it because that's confusing.
Amazing. And right. I think it's also worth dividing some of these problems into the two pieces. There's other Josh's comment about kind of the malicious angle, which is very real, and it's something that's happening. And some of the packaging ecosystems like NPM and Python are doing quite a bit of work to try to stem that. But there's also the angle of just non-malicious maintainer. Either they don't understand, they don't want to do something. I mean, there's many reasons you might not want to sign a package in something like Arch Linux, because signing things is often hard. And if I'm a developer, if I'm a one-person open source project, and most open source projects are one person, that's kind of another secret that not often talked about. But if I'm one person, I just want to write code. I don't want to do code reviews. I don't want to worry about multi-factor authentication. I don't want to have to reach out to get, an audit done on my software. I just want to write code.
I don't want to test my code. God forbid.
Yeah. Oh, right. Seriously. What's up with that?
Well, and more of the point,
what are you, a developer? Yeah.
Like somebody writes code that scratches their own itch and they're nice enough to release it under a good open source license. Why do they suddenly have some sort of obligation to the world and to you because you chose to use it?
Because someone's got to do that homework. I don't want to.
But I think it's a two-way street. We should, in that light, contribute back. And that's the beauty.
But that's an existential question. Why open source in the first place? I think it's because it's free. But why do people?
Well, it's not just free, but it's unencumbered. I don't have to get permission. See, and that's the thing. Like, even if it was $0 cost, but I had to fill out a form and send a form in to use it, no, right? Whereas the majority of open source, you just yank it down and
So unencumbered meaning, I think it's what Paul was alluding to. We don't have to comment the code. We don't have to add features. We don't have to test it. Does it work? Are you using it? Are you getting benefit from it? Go away.
Not even just that, though. I mean, if we look at how the procurement process works at most companies, like I'm at a small company, and if someone says, I want to buy this piece of software, there's a process that's gone through. But if one of the developers pulls in a new open source dependency, great. Like there's, there's work that happens, but it's definitely like legal doesn't get involved.
But doesn't some of this...
No, but they should.
Does this
but most places don't have the maturity to know what they're shipping.
Does this freedom come with responsibility, though? I mean, we touched upon the Incard. I think you articulated it, right? The freedom in open source comes with this unencumbered, I can write software and have all the freedom I want. I can test it, I can not test it, I can comment it, I can not. Basically, that's the freedom to develop and distribute software with no restrictions, right? Doesn't that come with some responsibility?
So shouldn't people that write poetry write good poetry before they give it away for free?
Look, I've read your poetry. It's not exactly the best, okay?
Right. I mean, people who paint terrible pictures not show them off so that we don't have that eye pain, right? There's code is an expression. I mean, there is literally artistic code. Like look up Ouroboros code, right? It's this code that compiles other languages and codes and eventually comes full circle and builds itself in like 50 some languages. There's, I don't understand morally or ethically how we can put strong obligations on these people now. And that's not to say I don't think we shouldn't, because to some degree, there's different scales of project, right? There's like the one-person project like Josh mentions. Then there's stuff like OpenSSL, which actually does have some degree of funding and professionalism. Should OpenSSL be held to a higher standard than a one developer project in NPM? Well, probably yes. And more to the point, though, is this realistically possible? Well, yes. They have funding. You can give them money. You can be part of the solution. But the challenge is, like, again, the license explicitly states, like, I'm giving this away for free. It's not my problem if you don't like the taste of it.
So I have a question.
What do you think?
I'm sorry.
Hold on. Jeff, and then man.
It'll relate ultimately, but bear with me.
Look out for rant.
It's not a rant so much, but it's more of a historical context. When I first came out into the private sector in the mid '90s and started working with companies, and all the way through into the early 2010s, well into my PCI QSA days, most of the organizations I was working for, they had policy that stated, you can't use open source anything. Everything's got to go through the procurement process and so on and so forth. I guess existentially, I get all the reasons why to use open source that we've been discussing, but I guess has the corporate position changed in the last couple years? I haven't stumbled over it recently in my second life as a QSA, so I can't answer the question. But has it changed sort of as a corporate perspective? If so, why? If not, how are we continuing to get away with it? And tie that back into this existential, there was a perception in the early days that open source bad, closed sourced, vetted, whatever you're purchasing could be validated. And somewhere along the line, I feel like that shifted over to, well, you can't trust the closed source proprietary. You absolutely can trust the open source because you can see it. When did that shift happen and why? And other than what we've already cited in terms of the unencumbering, and I still think personally it's all dollars and cents.
Yeah. So historically, like Red Hat murdered Sun, straight up. Right, everybody replaced their Sun.
And I was going to ask
but how did Red Hat murder Sun?
When you were looking at the source code at Red Hat and you took out everything, I was going to ask, didn't you eventually get down to Solaris code?
No, I had a brief interest in Solaris when I was in my younger days, but I realized it was foolish because I realized I had a Solaris box. I actually bought one, and I tried to make it do something useful, and I had to go get Sun ports and do a whole bunch of other stuff, and it was just way more painful than Linux. But Red Hat murdered Sun by virtue of driving down development costs of Linux, so much so that Sun just could not compete. Right? Sun could not spend billions of dollars on this operating system every year to be feature compatible or even comparable with Linux. Right, and it died.
Well, it was also the fact they had to buy their special hardware.
Essentially, it is a dollars and cents thing.
Yeah. So all these companies, a lot of companies ran with open source, and so instead of spending tens of thousands of hours building a web server, they just turned it on. And the other thing is, it's not just the money savings; it's the time.
Well, they got support, Kurt, right? Red Hat took off in the enterprise because people got support, and it didn't matter if it was good support or bad support.
No, it wasn't support,
right?
It was insurance.
Yeah.
You got somebody to yell at if things went wrong. You got somebody to blame. See, now you weren't, I chose open source and it went all sideways, so that's on me. It's like, no, I picked Red Hat and they screwed up. Let's yell at Red Hat.
No.
Well, that's the way it was. I think it's changed. And to kind of address Jeff's question.
Good point. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, and to address Jeff's question, like all these companies are using open source and it's everywhere. You know, there's no company on the planet that's not using it. And I think the reason we are having the discussions we're having today is because developers started using it, no one noticed. And then after, basically, I think Log4Shell is what really, really opened some eyes. Now everyone looks around and they're like, holy crap, open source is everywhere. And they have to figure out, what are we going to do with this stuff? How do we start managing it? How do we start taking care of it? And to the credit of everyone I have talked to and interacted with, I have not seen any corporate legal departments try to bring the hammer down and say no open source, because we all know how that one would end.
It's too late. Like, especially in the services world, you can't build services without open source. It's just impossible. Like, you need to parse web requests. Okay, you need an open source web server. You got to handle JSON. That's it.
And yet you've got many companies that are taking on a significant expense to track open source dependencies and open source software, and they're using companies like Black Duck specifically to find all of their open source software to make sure that their licensing and their issues and everything else is done properly. And so you can say, hey, it's just it's just insurance, it's just checking, and I'll accept that. But on the other hand, there's a mindset there that open source has to be tracked because of Heartbleed, because of Log4j, because of XYZ. You know all the names. Most of them are ridiculous names, but that's another story entirely. I mean,
whatever. It's awesome.
I mean,
well, this is true for anything a company consumes, right? They need to know where their screws come from. Are they the right screws? Are they the right size? Are they the right thread pitch? Like,
so now we've come full circle. Wait.
Yeah.
Your point is correct. It is a supply chain issue. And the supply chain issue, as you put it, you were in supply chain before it got cool. You know, I get it. Trust me. Been there, done that.
You're still not cool. Oh, I'm sorry.
You're not Ken Thompson cool.
Jeff,
but okay, continue.
You're just jealous of the coolness. Anyway, so the problem is that you're right. It is merely one more supply chain issue. It doesn't mean that open source is that superior or that inferior or any. It's just different. Okay. And I realize you're all about open source, and in a lot of ways, so am I, as I talk to you on my Windows machine with my dozens of closed source gadgets. But anyway, but the problem is that it is an issue. There are insecurities. There are people that write open source software, release it to the wild, and then never look at it again. There are updates that are critically needed that aren't done because this entire genre of open source software is, what's that XKCD cartoon? It's depending on two guys in Nebraska who don't get paid for it. Okay, that kind of thing.
Well, it's actually, and Josh was actually somewhat incorrect. The average open source project is actually less than one developer. Right? If you actually look at ecosystems like NPM and you look at some of these developers and how many packages they have, 10, 20, 50, 100, or packagers are worse. Like, you look at some of the packagers and ecosystems, and these guys or people have, 1,000 packages that they're packaging. So like, it's, if you have 1,000 children, you can't really parent them all.
Hey, I have one more quick question. Do you draw a distinction, or do we as an industry draw a distinction these days between what we're talking about open source and what used to be called freeware? And what I mean by that is a company like downloading an application and using it that they just pull off the web versus pulling down components and parts where they're using it in development to build something.
I would argue there's a difference, but it's kind of technically correct differences.
Yeah.
Where open source is fundamentally meant to be something that is a community model where you can get involved and participate. Whereas if you're just downloading free stuff, you're just using someone else's free stuff. But I think the way the vast majority of people use open source, it's the freeware model where they're just downloading and using it, and there's nothing wrong with that, mind you. Like that is understood and expected in the open source universe, where only a small portion of people who use something are ever going to join a community and participate. But I think it's kind of one of those technically correct differences.
Well, and I mean, I would count this like doing the global security database. One of the things we explicitly want is to have a lot of free riders. That is a win for us. It's just that simple. Like, and it will hopefully help the industry be less terrible, maybe even better one day. Although I think that's a bit off.
Does that mean next year will
Optimist.
Does that mean next year will be the year of the Linux desktop?
Every year is year of the Linux desktop.
Actually, the Linux desktop happened. I mean, all those Chromebooks.
Yeah.
Like my kids, like the Edmonton Public School Board is a Chrome shop. You know, like it happened. It's just it's on phones and Chromebooks.
Well, wait, where do you live?
Edmonton, Alberta.
Damn, I was in Edmonton in September. How next time when I come back next year, we must get together.
Yeah,
there you go. Mandy, did you have a question earlier? Were you trying to chime in?
I did. Part of it kind of ended up being covered. So thank you. But I actually had a question. I'm not sure how to formulate it yet, though. I was thinking about when dealing with like the C-suite or with dealing with the organizations and those that aren't directly involved in anything with IT or with security. When it comes to having to sell them on, well, hey, let's use this open source versus this closed source item, or however much they actually have that overplay. Because the corporation is driven by money and by profits, can either of you speak to how much the organization then assumes that, oh, they're bringing up, open source stuff. Hey, this is great for our bottom line. But then they themselves put the pressure on that they will have the exact same benefits from this open source item that would have come natively with a closed source item, and don't allow the practitioners to actually have the time to handle the open source stuff correctly?
Yeah, that's a good question.
This is a great question. I mean, this is how Red Hat built their entire business model in the early days, was functionally this. And I think you see when I go out and talk to various organizations using open source, I mean, you see this mindset in some places that, oh, it's free, right? It's just free like it's free like a puppy in reality, but they think it's like free as in beer, where it's just, I'll take this free thing, I'll use it. Right. And this kind of circles back to the very beginning of our conversation, is there's this kind of perceived attitude of open source being free, but it does have costs associated with it that we haven't paid. And so we built up a lot of technical debt in many instances that's now coming due, because people are asking questions like, how do we secure this? What are we even
what's
using?
In your software?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Like what's in this thing?
I think we've escaped, and this is something Kurt and I actually argued about a couple episodes ago on the podcast, is I'm wondering in a couple of years, when a lot of the open source that was pulled in, say, 2 to 5 years ago is now really old, are we going to see weird problems because it's just super old and people are using it, it's full of security issues? Or are we going to kind of get lucky and everything will still work? I don't know.
You brought up the OpenSSL thing, right? OpenSSL 1.x end of life. When did you say?
Next year.
Next year, 2023.
Yeah, September 2023.
And like, hands up, who thinks TV manufacturers are actually going to upgrade from OpenSSL 1 to 3? Like, really? Yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, it was my example exactly, is that I thought it was ironic that if you're running an older version of OpenSSL, you're more secure than if you're running the latest version. Or the not latest version as of yesterday, whatever it was, right? Was that yesterday?
That's right.
Yesterday.
That's right.
Yeah. But yeah, like see, because this stuff is never like, there's no like, there's like this weird sort of digital rot, let's call it, in the form of like increasing vulnerabilities, increasing bugs, increasing incompatibility, right? So ignoring security vulnerabilities, older software Oh, IPv6 support is a great example, right? A lot of stuff doesn't really support IPv6 if it's old enough. It just doesn't, right? And so you kind of get this like digital rot where the product kind of works worse and worse. I had a friend who had to buy a new ArcNet card for their cell counting machine, and I'm like, why? And she's like, it's $60,000 to replace it, so we're buying a new ArcNet card because it talks to this Windows 95 machine. I'm like, fair enough. And there's actually a company in Australia that still makes them. But with software, the problem is it is everywhere. And we can't afford to have like digital rot and self-driving cars that like don't see people wearing blue shirts. We can't have digital, like you look at people's routers, right? And they're, if they're more than 2-3 years old, they're probably not supported. Same thing with Android phones, right? Like Android phones in Canada, you're lucky to get 1 or 2 years, maybe 3 years of vendor support and updates for your Android phone. Because it's controlled by the carrier. And so, like I'm always kind of, but we have not to pick on the US, but the US like didn't like pretty much every bridge in the United States, get like a D grade from, the Society of Civil Engineers or whatever when they audited them. Like infrastructure costs a lot of money to maintain and upgrade. And at some point, hopefully we don't have major pieces of software falling over and killing people, but well, I mean, maybe that's what will happen. And then we'll have some hearings about it.
But is older software that doesn't change very often that provides a function like OpenSSL is a good example? Is that really more or less secure? Like if more people have looked at that because it's an older version, it's been out in the open for longer, patches have been applied, and then like at some point they're like, there's not a whole lot of new functionality. We're doing that in the next version, introducing bugs like we just saw in OpenSSL. But 1.1.1.
But people find new classes of bugs. Like I remember when cross-site scripting
continues.
I remember when cross-site scripting became a thing because I'm old enough to remember a static web. There was no possibility for cross-site scripting back in 95, 98 because just you didn't send data to a web server that then passed it back.
GeoCities. GeoCities.
Yeah, pretty much, right?
Under construction.
Yeah. And so somebody might find an entirely new class of vulnerabilities that is present in OpenSSL 1. Something we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah, it's an interesting mindset, Paul, that you have, which is that as I add new functionality, I add new bugs. As I change the code, I add new bugs. In reality, it's actually quite the opposite. Rapid release software is often the most secure because they don't have time to introduce vulnerabilities before it's upgraded.
But also you get into cases where introducing new features undoes a bug fix for a previous one. We've seen that. I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but that certainly happens where you've iterated so many times that like that bug fix you did 3 years ago, like you just reintroduced it and now you got to patch it again. So that's
old vulns in new code or new vulns in old code. There's several different classes of vulnerabilities that kinds of thing, and not just classes of vulnerabilities, but sort of categories. Like I said, you can have a static code, at least vaguely static because it's matured, it's end of life. But if you discover a whole new class of vuln, you now have a new vuln in old code. And an old vuln in new code would be when you undo, like you said, you undo a bug fix or a hot fix or a whatever.
Yeah.
There's so many ways to introduce bugs.
And one thing to remember too is by definition, the older the code is in something, the more likely it is that it's really hard and expensive to replace or upgrade. So it's never going to happen. Because if it was easy to do, they would have done it.
Or
why does every bank in the damn world have a mainframe? Because replacing them would be a god-blessed nightmare.
Yep, that's right. But now, a
everything's
mainframe is maybe a good example because they're paying someone an enormous amount of money to keep that mainframe alive versus open source, where I'm just some nerd who wants to write software and I don't care about the stuff I wrote 2 years ago because I'm doing a new interesting thing that I want to be doing.
But if we all have an SBOM, I mean, this problem just fixes itself, right?
Oh, I'm going to hit you.
Well,
I'm going to hit you. No, SBOMs are useful, but they
penalty,
are
taunting. That's a penalty.
I mean, to me, SBOMs are just the first. SBOMs are the first step in a very, very long journey, and part of it is more than just SBOM. It's having the ideas of like having frameworks and testing rigs that actually give you the visibility into what you're doing. For example, did a programmer change a compiler flag that matters? right? That's something that Red Hat was checking for ages ago with our internal build systems. You know, like, was the binary stripped, right? Because like I've seen, you know, I literally have found malware where they forgot to strip the binary, and it's like, oh, so here's where the guy lives, you know, because it was like some data in the binary that made it real easy to track them down. And so part of it is just this, it's a maturity piece around software as a whole, where a lot of places don't have a lot of maturity. And the good news is, though, it's getting a lot easier and cheaper to do, right? You can just throw it all into GitHub, a few services, and be done with it. You don't have to build it yourself anymore. And, you know, like Red Hat has this like huge Rube Goldberg machine that's like 20 some years old internally to do this, because it did not exist when Red Hat started, right? But now it does. And the trick, though, is getting people to move to it, to start using it, to spend a bit of money and, more importantly, time and effort going from whatever it is they're doing now to a more modern process.
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen this transition happen with like manufacturing and Six Sigma and all these other things where, you know, they went from like the Stone Ages to modern, you know, industrial processes that are highly reliable and highly safe.
Can you just say process one more time?
Process.
Okay, thank you.
It's a Canadian. We got Canadian.
Love the Canadian way. It's amazing. I just have 5 questions left for Kurt and Josh. Are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Let's do it.
Sure.
All right, I'll start with Josh because he's up on my screen. 3 words to describe yourself.
Oh man, 3 words. I would say grumpy, old, and tired.
Kurt, 3 words.
Bravo.
Kurt, 3 words to describe yourself.
Hopeful, a little bit tired, and stumped.
Kurt, if you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Probably a long-range rifle.
Josh?
Is it open source?
Yeah. Josh?
He printed it himself. It's basically
There we go.
There you go. Josh, if you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Ketchup.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be, Josh?
The title would be Go Away.
Kurt, if you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Buy this book and make me rich.
Kurt, what is your favorite hacker movie?
Honestly, Hackers. There's something about it. It's just so ridiculous. I love it. And Penn and Tell, like having Penn in there. Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Josh, what is your favorite hacker movie?
Yeah, it's Hackers also. I love that movie
2
so
points
much.
for Paul. Jeff and I have this thing like I score points if people answer Hackers.
Forget visiting you in Edmonton next year.
If it's my favorite Hackers movie for actual proper hacking, Sneakers.
There you go.
100% Sneakers. The trash scene.
So maybe we each get a point.
So we split the doubleheader, Paul.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Josh, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
You know, man, you ask everyone this, and I thought about this a lot. And the only 2 I can think of is Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen.
Oh.
Like, there's no better combination.
Kurt, your celebrity parents.
That's who I want now. Yeah, I want. Yeah.
You're just stealing his answer.
Well, I was originally going to go with Neil Patrick Harris and whose partner, unfortunately, I can't remember the name of, because they seem like awesome dads. Like, have you seen their Halloween photos and stuff? Like,
the Halloween photos are amazing.
Right?
Oh my God, their kids get the best friggin' costumes.
I know. So, but yeah.
That's awesome.
But I feel like with Patrick Stewart, I'd have a better education.
Yes.
But
Perhaps.
Neil Patrick Harris would probably be the more fun dad.
You can find Josh and Kurt's podcast, the Open Source Security Podcast, at opensourcesecurity.io. Josh and Kurt, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
This has been awesome. Thanks, man. I mean, it's a treat. This podcast is legend, and I love it. So nothing pleases me more than to have been on it. Thank you, Paul.
Love you guys. Keep up the great work.
Thanks.